And Deputy Brendan Howlin is 3 minutes.
In relation to the matter just raised, perhaps the Minister for Justice might come into the House and let's tease out those matters in some detail, perhaps later today or tomorrow. I want to raise a different issue, and that is the gap between the earnings of men and women in this country, which has worsened from 12% in 2002 to 14% in the most recent CSO figures. That means women are working for more than a month free of charge compared to men annually. One of the great benefits of joining the European Union was the requirement of equal pay for equal work, as well as the abolition of the naked bias, such as the law that required women to leave the public service on marriage. We brought in the equal pay legislation in 1974, a long time ago, but we still await pay parity. In the past, this was explained by differences in qualifications between men and women, but today significantly more young women than men have third-level qualifications. Previously, we might have explained that the pay gap happened because many women stopped working while their children were in school. This is no longer the case for a great number of families in Ireland. There is a gender difference in the professions taken up by men and women, and that in turn might explain some of the differences in pay. But there is a question about whether we value women's work as much as we do men's work. And there's a real question about whether men and women are actually being paid equally for the same work. The Labour Party, as you know, Taoiseach, has progressed legislation through all stages of the Seanad for the mandatory reporting by larger companies of the levels of pay by gender. The government have promised its own legislation, which has not been delivered. We're happy to work with government through all stages of the Dáil to make sure that the legislation that is, as I said, past one of the houses of the Oireachtas can be swiftly enacted into law. We know that mandatory reporting has worked in other countries, and we believe it will work here. In some cases, companies may not even be aware of the extent of the wage differences in their own workforce. But ignorance is no excuse. And this law that we're proposing could remove that excuse. So can I ask the Taoiseach, does the government agree that a 14% gender pay cap is simply unacceptable and unsustainable? And will the government undertake to support Labour's legislation, already passed by the Seanad, help it through the Dáil as the swiftest, fastest mechanism to address this important issue?
3 minutes.
Thanks very much. Yes, the government accepts that the gender pay gap of 14% is unacceptable and unfair, and is a hallmark of gender inequality in our society. The Deputy will also be aware that such pay gaps are not unique to Ireland. They exist across the developed world, and even in very progressive countries like some of the Nordic countries, they actually have a bigger gender pay gap than we do, but that doesn't make it in any way acceptable. Equal pay for equal work was introduced back in 1974 as a consequence of European law, and that has made a real difference. However, we still, more than 30 years later, have a gender pay gap, and the reasons for that are multiple. One of the reasons is that more women work part-time than men, and that is often because women are still expected to bear the greater burden of caring in society, caring for children and caring for older people, and therefore are more likely to work part-time. So that's something that isn't simple to change, but can be changed, for example, by providing more subsidised childcare, which we're doing, by providing paternity benefit to men so that more men take up the caring role, and that's one of the things DEFI has to change. And secondly is, of course, gender bias when it comes to promotions. And yesterday I attended in the National Gallery of Minister Mitchell O'Connor the launch of the actions that we're taking in the higher education sector, and this is just one example. If you take the higher education sector, our universities and our ITs, roughly 50% of the lecturers are female, but when you get up to the professor level, it's only 25%. And it's evident there that we need to put in place accelerators so that more women get promoted, and in that way help to close the gender pay gap. And you'd be aware of the decisions that we made in that regard yesterday, which I think are very progressive, albeit controversial in parts. In terms of legislation, on the 26th of June last, we approved the general scheme of the Gender Pay Gap Information Bill. The Joint Oireachtas Committee on Justice and Equality is going to carry out pre-legislative scrutiny on the general scheme of that bill on the 21st of November. So the legislation is there. It's going to be before the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Justice and Equality on the 21st of November. So that's only 8 days' time. And I would appeal to all parties in the House to get that done quickly and to have that pre-legislative scrutiny done before the end of the year so that we can proceed to get this legislation done.
Others are worse. The Taoiseach says there's no excuse, and yet he uses it as an excuse. We have a vehicle, which is a bill that's passed in the other House. We can pass it through here very readily. The notion that we're going to start a new bill with pre-legislative scrutiny in a couple of weeks' time, with no prospect, obviously, of it being enacted into law in this calendar year, makes a nonsense of new politics. If you're serious, Taoiseach, about addressing the issue, it surely doesn't matter whether the bill comes from the Labour Party or whether it's enacted or drafted by government. There was no fundamental issue with the legislation as it passed through the Seanad. In fact, it was promised to be supported. Why would you not simply want to address this issue, if you agree with me that it is one of critical importance, that gender-biased pay is something that is not acceptable, and let's start the process by shining light on companies' pay bills so that we know exactly how they fare in terms of gender-focused pay. And will you, I ask again, simply accept the legislation? If you want to amend it during a committee stage here, let's do that. But let's get this done rather than pretending to want to do something, but when the vehicle, the mechanism is presented, resisting it.
Taoiseach has 1 minute.
I wasn't attempting to offer an excuse, Deputy. I think while we have a long way to go, nobody can dispute that this government has a good record and has done a lot when it comes to gender equality and advancing the rights and freedoms of women in our society. Rather, I mentioned it just to point out the complexity of this issue. It surprises people to hear that some of the Nordic countries with subsidised childcare, with a long-standing history of gender equality and progress, actually have higher gender gaps than we do. And that just demonstrates the number of different factors that are at play and how what may appear to be solutions at first look are not solutions when you actually dig into them. But I don't want to engage in a contest. I want to get this legislation done. I don't really care whether it's the government bill that goes first or whether it's your bill that goes first or who gets credit for it. We do have some difficulties, though, with your bill, as it empowers the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission to draw up a gender pay gap reporting scheme. And under your bill, the IHREC could do this or need not do it. It would just be at its own discretion as to whether it does it or not. And we also believe that your bill would require a lot of amendments to it to make it acceptable to government, including amendments to the long and short titles, and that's why it is our preference that we proceed with the government bill. But quite frankly, but quite frankly, I'm not interested in a contest with the Labour Party who gets credit for doing it. So 8 days' time, this is before the Joint Oireachtas Committee. Let's just get it done.
Your time has expired, Taoiseach. Deputy Coppinger, who's 3 minutes.